The auditorium held maybe 400 people, and Leandre was the kind of man who could make each one feel like they were getting a private audience. He sat on the collision stage, with the easy confidence of someone who had rehearsed sincerity, so many times it had become indistinguishable from the real thing. The moderator, a tech journalist from Vancouver with thick-framed glasses and a practiced neutrality, leaned forward with her microphone. So let's get into the architecture itself. The Meridian platform is genuinely sophisticated. People in the industry want to know, how did you actually build it? Leon paused just long enough to seem reflective. Then he smiled, the way a man smiles when he's about to tell a story he's already polished at a dozen dinner tables. I've always believed, he said, that real founders don't outsource the hard parts. I spent close to 2 years in the trenches, learning the infrastructure, writing the first versions of the core logic myself, getting my hands dirty. He shook his head with a kind of fond nostalgia. Humbling process. Necessary process. The audience responded warmly. Someone near the back started clapping before he was done. Hazel Birch was sitting in the 4th row, center left, with a lanyard around her neck that said attendee. She had a small notebook on her knee. A habit from university she'd never dropped, and for the first part of his answer, she wrote nothing. Then she clicked her pen closed. Not because she was upset, not yet, but because something she had been telling herself for 7 years, that this was a partnership, that the imbalance was temporary, that recognition would come, had just very quietly become something she could no longer say with a straight face to herself. 2 years in the trenches, getting his hands dirty. She had written the first 40,000 lines of code. She had built the infrastructure on weeknights and Sunday mornings, in their condo on King Street West, while Leon went to networking events and came home smelling like the open bar at some co-working space launch party. She had set up the AWS environment. She had negotiated the Stripe integration. She had documented the entire architecture in a Notion workspace she still maintained, alone, on Tuesday evenings, when he thought she was just doing work stuff. She had done all of this alongside a full-time role as a lead developer at a financial technology firm in the financial district, because someone had to keep them solvent while Meridian found its footing. She had never asked for a press mention. She had never insisted on being named in the pitch deck. At the time, she had told herself that was generosity. That was partnership. That was what you did for someone you believed in. She understood now, sitting in that auditorium, that she had confused belief in someone's potential with permission to erase herself from her own story. The applause faded. The moderator moved on. Leon laughed at something someone said from the audience. Hazel put the notebook in her bag and looked at him. At the ease of him, the warmth of him, the complete and apparently unconscious certainty that the room belonged to him, and thought, I built the thing you are standing on top of. I built it, and you don't even know it's mine. She had a lot of practice at sitting quietly with that particular thought. She was very good at it by now. Leandre had what people in their circle often called founder energy. He walked into rooms and rooms reorganized themselves around him. He was persuasive without being pushy, enthusiastic without being manic, visionary without being vague, or at least, he was good enough at sounding all of those things that the distinction rarely came up. What he was not: organized, patient with technical detail, capable of sitting with a problem long enough to understand it before moving on to the next one. Good with money in any sustained, practical way. Hazel had known this about him since their 2nd year together. She had for a long time told herself it was complementary. She was the structure, he was the momentum. She was the roots, he was the branches. She was the one who read contracts before signing them, who set up the auto payments, who tracked the runway in a shared spreadsheet. She was the only one who ever opened. For 3 years before Meridian, there had been other ventures. A podcast network that produced 6 episodes. A corporate retreat company that ran 2 events before Leon decided the margins weren't interesting enough. A newsletter about sustainable investing that went out 4 times, won a mention from a Toronto media blogger, and then quietly stopped because Leon had moved on to the next idea before the list was large enough to matter. Through each one, Hazel had paid the rent. Not because he asked her to exactly, because the conversation about rent was never a conversation that happened. It simply arrived as a bill, and she had a salary and he was building something. And so she paid it, and then she went back to her desk at 6:30 in the morning and wrote more code before her day job started. When Meridian launched and started getting traction, real traction, a Series A round, a profile and beta kit, an invitation to the Collision main stage, she felt something she recognized as pride, not for herself, for what she had made. The way you might feel watching a building go up that you had designed, knowing your name isn't on the architectural firm's letterhead, but the load-bearing walls are yours. That particular kind of pride, she would later understand, had a shelf life. The conference was the moment it expired. She did not confront him after the panel. She found him in the hallway outside the green room, surrounded by the particular cluster of people who always surrounded him: investors, journalists, other founders, a woman from a Montreal VC who had a podcast. Leon spotted her over the woman's shoulder and gave her the look he always gave her in those moments. Fond, quick, a little apologetic, the look that meant later, we'll talk later. She smiled back. She was good at that. On the drive home along the Gardiner, she didn't cry and she didn't yell and she didn't rehearse an argument. She listened to a CBC podcast about municipal water infrastructure and thought about what she actually owned. The condo was in her name. The mortgage was in her name. She was the primary account holder on the joint checking account they used for household expenses, because Leon's credit history had been patchy when they moved in 5 years ago, and they'd agreed at the time that it was simpler this way. The cloud infrastructure for Meridian, the AWS root account, the domain registration, the Stripe merchant account, the GitHub organization, the Notion workspace, the Google Workspace admin console. All of it was registered under her personal email address or her card, because she was the one who had set it up, and she had never gotten around to transferring any of it formally, and neither had Leon, because Leon had never thought to ask. She had built a platform that was now hosting 70,000 users. Her name appeared nowhere in its public documentation. Her credentials controlled everything that kept it running. She thought about that for the rest of the drive. Not with anger. With something much quieter and much more final. The kind of clarity that only comes after you have stopped arguing with what you already know. People who hadn't lived it often asked the obvious question: why did she stay so long? It was a fair question, and the honest answer was not a simple one. She stayed because she had been investing herself into the version of Leon she believed he could become, not the version he was actually being. She stayed because each new failure came with a new explanation that was just plausible enough, and each new pivot contained just enough logic to keep hope from fully dying. She stayed because the condo was on King Street West, and the mortgage was in her name, and leaving felt like admitting she had been wrong about all of it. The relationship, the company, the 7 years, and admitting that all at once was an enormous thing to do on a Tuesday. She stayed, if she was being completely honest, because the sunk cost of caring deeply about someone does not behave rationally. Because you do not simply stop believing in a person the way you stop a direct deposit. Because hope for a long time is cheaper than certainty. What changed at the conference was not the amount of the cost. It was that she finally looked at what she had been paying it for. The lawyer's name was René Coté, and her office was on Bay Street in a building that smelled like coffees and expensive carpet. She had 17 years in corporate and family law and the particular stillness of someone who had heard every version of every story and no longer felt the need to perform a reaction. Hazel walked in on a Tuesday morning with a folder and a USB drive and sat down across the desk without any preamble. "I need to understand what belongs to me," she said, "the personal assets and the business ones, and I need to understand how to separate them cleanly." Renee looked at the folder, then at Hazel. "Walk me through the business structure." Hazel walked her through it. The co-founder agreement, which named her as technical co-founder and director, with a 35% equity stake. The fact that her equity had never been diluted in writing, though Leon had been gradually presenting Meridian as a sole founder company in press materials for the past year. The intellectual property question. The codebase she had written, which the agreement nominally assigned to the company, but which contained 3 years of her labor and had never been formally audited or valued. The infrastructure accounts. The domain. The fact that Leon did not have the root credentials for a single system the company relied on. Renee was quiet for a moment. "Your equity position is documented?" "Yes." "And you have records of your technical contributions? Timestamps, commit history, anything that establishes authorship?" 743 commits over 38 months, Hazel said. "I pulled the report before I came here." Renee picked up her pen. "All right, this is workable. The personal assets are relatively straightforward. The business is more complex, but your position is considerably stronger than you might expect." Hazel nodded. She wasn't surprised. She had always been the one who read the contracts. She moved with the same precision she brought to systems architecture. Methodical, documented, sequential, no wasted steps. She met with a financial planner and opened a personal checking account at a different institution, redirecting her direct deposit. She consulted an IP lawyer about the code she had written and received a clear opinion about her rights as its author. She did not remove her access from any of the Meridian systems. That would have been sabotage, and sabotage was not the point. She simply stopped being available. She stopped checking the system alerts at midnight. She stopped pushing fixes for bugs she noticed in the monitoring dashboard. She stopped being the invisible maintenance crew that had kept the platform running quietly for 3 years. She also prepared the handover documentation, everything, every password, every account credential, every architectural decision and its rationale, organized in a folder that she would send to the company's registered agent on the day she resigned. She wanted to be clear, to herself and to anyone who might later look at what she had done. This was not destruction, this was departure. At home, nothing changed. She made dinner on the nights it was her turn. She asked Leon about his day. She listened to him talk about the term sheet for the Series B, about a new enterprise client in Mississauga, about a Forbes contributor who was interested in profiling him. She nodded in the right places. Leon noticed nothing. He had a gift for not noticing things that didn't require him to act on them. She packed a bag one evening while he was on a call in the other room. Not everything, just what was hers in any meaningful sense. Her work equipment, the hard copies of her employment contract and her co-founder agreement. The photographs she cared about, the coffee pour-over she had bought herself 2 Christmases ago and that Leon had never once used. She carried it to her car in 2 quiet trips and that was that. She slept in the condo that night with the particular stillness of someone who has made a decision so complete. There is nothing left to turn over. She chose a Wednesday, because she wanted a full working week to begin without her, before the weekend gave Leon nowhere to go. At 7 in the morning, before he was awake, she placed a sealed envelope on the kitchen counter beside his coffee mug. Then she left. She drove to a cafe on Roncesvalles that she liked and had never gone to with Leon and ordered a flat white and opened her laptop. At 8:15 she sent the formal resignation letter to the company's registered agent, carbon copying Renee and the IP lawyer. Attached to the email was the complete handover document. 112 pages, every credential, every system, every decision that had ever existed only in her head and nowhere else. At 8:30 she submitted the formal notice to withdraw from the co-founder agreement, triggering the buyout clause that her equity entitled her to. At 9 she called the domain registrar and initiated a transfer of administrative contact to the company's registered business address, making it no longer hers but no longer inaccessible either. She was not trying to take the business down. She was trying to make visible, one careful step at a time, how completely she had been holding it up. By 10 her phone had 3 missed calls from Leon. By 11 it had 9. She did not answer. She finished her coffee and opened a job posting a recruiter had sent her the previous month. A senior architect role at a fintech firm with an office in Liberty Village and a salary 20% above what she was currently making. She began composing her application. The envelope on the counter said 3 things. It said, I am a co-founder of this company and my equity stake is 35%. My lawyers will be in touch regarding the buyout. It said, the infrastructure you depend on has been fully documented and the handover is complete. Nothing has been damaged. You have everything you need to continue. Whether you can is a different question. It said, I have been building things in this relationship for 7 years. I am going to build something for myself now. 1 paragraph each. She had drafted it 11 times over 3 weeks and the final version was the shortest. What Leon discovered over the days and weeks that followed was not a dramatic collapse. It was something subtler and, in its way, more total. He discovered that the Series B investors had due diligence questions about the technical architecture that he could not answer, because he had never understood the technical architecture. He had been describing it in pitch meetings for 2 years using language Hazel had written in a 1-page summary document. He had memorized the way you memorize lines for an audition. He discovered that the AWS billing, which had previously been managed invisibly, was now sending invoices to an email address that no one at the company was monitoring, and that without someone to process those invoices, the account would eventually lapse. He discovered that the GitHub repository, the one that held the entire codebase of a platform, currently used by 70,000 people, required 2-factor authentication, and that the backup code for the root account was on page 44 of the handover document, which he had opened twice and closed both times, because reading it felt like being handed the controls of a plane he did not know how to fly. He discovered that the Notion workspace, which contained 3 years of architectural documentation, was accessible. She had made sure of that, but that reading it was different from understanding it, and understanding it was different from being able to act on it. He had spent 3 years going to conferences, while she had spent 3 years building the thing he had been conferencing about, and those were not the same 3 years. He called a development consulting firm that quoted him a retainer rate that made him go very quiet on the phone. He called the developer who'd been on contract for 6 months, who told him honestly, as he had told Leon before, that he mostly maintained the systems Hazel had built, and didn't feel comfortable making structural changes without someone more senior involved. He called 2 investors to try to explain the situation and found that the explanation did not land the way he'd hoped. One of them was polite. The other asked a question about technical leadership continuity that Leon could not answer in a way that moved the conversation forward. The Series B fell through. The enterprise client in Mississauga paused the contract pending platform stability reviews. The Forbes piece never ran. His social media went quiet. Not deleted, just quiet. And in the absence of the posts about building and grinding and staying in the arena, the people who had been nodding along began asking questions that had no clean answers. A legal notice arrived informing him that the co-founder equity buyout proceedings had been formally initiated, and that the timeline for settlement had been established by counsel. He sat in the condo that wasn't his condo and looked at the notice for a long time. The coffee he'd made himself was cold. He had forgotten to buy the brand she always kept in the cupboard, and the one he'd picked up at the corner store didn't taste right, and he had never once in 7 years thought about which brand it was, or where it came from, or that there was a reason the coffee had always been exactly right when she was the one making it. He thought about that for a while. Hazel's new apartment was a 1-bedroom on a quiet street in the annex, 3rd floor, east-facing windows. It got good morning light. She had chosen it herself, spent 2 weekends looking, decided on this one because of the light and because it was hers in the only way that mattered. No shared history embedded in the walls, no invisible labor required to keep it running, no one else's name on the lease. She had started the new role in Liberty Village and found almost immediately that she was very good at it. This was not a surprise. She had been very good at the work all along. What was new was being seen being good at it. Having her decisions credited to her in meetings, having her name in the architecture documentation, having colleagues who came to her desk because they wanted her judgment, not because she was the only one who knew how something worked. She had friends now who knew where she lived. Some from the new job, some from a running group she'd joined because a colleague mentioned it, and it seemed like the kind of small, ordinary thing she hadn't had time for in years. She had evenings that didn't involve checking whether a deployment had failed somewhere across the city. She had Sunday mornings where the coffee tasted exactly right, because she had bought the brand she liked. It was not what she had imagined her life would look like at 36. It was considerably quieter and smaller and entirely her own. It was, she found, more than enough. She saw Leon once, about a year after she'd left. It was a Saturday afternoon in October, the kind of afternoon Toronto does unexpectedly well, cool and bright, the leaves along Bloor going amber and gold. She was coming out of a bookshop near Bathurst with 2 colleagues, still laughing at something someone had said inside. She nearly walked past him. He was standing near the entrance to a coffee shop, holding a paper cup, looking at his phone with the expression of a man who is waiting for a message that is not coming. He'd cut his hair shorter. He looked like someone who had recently had to learn how to manage a number of things he had never previously thought about. He saw her just as she saw him. His face did something complicated. "Hazel." She stopped. Her colleague slowed a half-step behind her, understanding without being told that this was a moment that required space. "Hey, Leon." He looked at her the way people look at someone they have been rehearsing a speech for and have now run out of preparation time. "You look well." "I am well." A pause. He shifted his weight. "I've been thinking about things I should have said, things I should have." He stopped. "Started again. I let you carry everything and I told myself I didn't know. I'm not sure anymore if that was true or just convenient." She looked at him. Not unkindly and not warmly either, just honestly. "Leon," she said, "knowing doesn't put back what the not knowing cost." He nodded slowly, as though that was exactly what he had expected and still was not fully prepared for. She held his gaze for a moment longer, then she turned back to her colleagues, and they continued down the street together, and the afternoon moved around them. A streetcar going by, pigeons lifting off a ledge, a dog pulling at its leash, the whole ordinary machinery of a city going about its business, unhurried and indifferent. Hazel Birch had spent 7 years building something that someone else put his name on. The code base, the infrastructure, the financial foundation that made it possible for him to stand on stages and describe himself as a builder. None of that work was gone. The systems she had architected were still running somewhere, maintained now by a team she had documented thoroughly enough that they no longer needed her. Her commits were still in the repository, each one timestamped, authored and attributed, because code, unlike a party or a press mention or a panel appearance, keeps an honest record of who was actually there. She had not walked away from the platform to punish him. She had walked away so that she could finally be the named architect of something she was actually allowed to own. What Leon had discovered in the quiet that came after she left was what she had always known, that the most essential infrastructure is almost always invisible, right up until the moment it isn't there. She had stopped making herself invisible. And nothing she was building now had anyone else's name on it but hers.